One of the things that I usually do at the end of the semester is we kind of do a review of the course as a whole and kind of everything things we've talked about. We don't have a lot of time to do that in an online setting. It's not as ideal, but I just want to share a couple of just some final thoughts as we're trying to put together the semester. And one of the questions you'll be asking, and I think it's on your exam, is what impact did this course have on you? So what did you learn? How are you going to live differently? In a book called Hitler's Cross, a guy named Pastor Erwin Lutzer said, "Today in America, the expression is still commonly heard, he's a fine Christian and a good citizen." He says, but we may yet have to decide between the two. And that's the reality that we're at right now, right? So right now we can be a fine Christian and a good American citizen, but we may, in the Western world, have to start making decisions between the two. And hopefully we're choosing, right? Sometimes people may say you're not a good citizen because you're not as tolerant, or your whatever accusation is put on you. But how are you going to live in light of what you've learned in this course? And I'm going to leave that to you. But just a few thoughts I wanted to share with you guys. There's a book by E. Stanley Jones. This is written back during World War II. And he says, we look back at our national history. It's talking about America. He says, we find that all the great changes for the better have come through small minorities. We too have a cause, the cause of causes, the kingdom of God. We have a leader that embodies that cause. Right? So the reason I have this quote in here is, in one sense, is you can say, well, it's history. Stuff's happened. I'm just one person. I don't really like history that much. What impact am I going to have moving forward? But in the world that we live in, right, we have Christ. We have a cause. We've got Jesus that embodies, right, the leader that embodies it. And so follow Jesus in living today's world. And something to keep in mind, this is from C.S. Lewis's The Screwtape Letters. He says, and this is right, one demon to another, talking about what they prioritize. And he says, I mean the delusion that the fate of a nation is in itself more important than that of individuals. The overthrow of free peoples and the multiplication of slave states are for us a means, but the real end is the destruction of individuals. And again, the point here of this quote is that Satan, he doesn't care whether America exists. He doesn't care whether the Western world is super Christian or super not. In fact, I heard a quote by Paul Tripp just the other day, and he said, Satan will give us our theology if he can have our hearts. And I think we need to bear that in mind as we're studying history and as we're forming opinions about politics and economics and religion and these things, that we want to make sure that we're not so caught up in the details that we forget about the heart, which is what Satan is after, but it's also what Jesus is after. So just bear that in mind in the present day. A couple other quick thoughts here. First of all, and this is back to Erwin Lutzer's book, Hitler's Cross. He says, we do not yet know where all this will end. He says, what we do know is that we have the high honor of representing Christ in the midst of this ideological shift. And what he's referring to is when he says, when Judeo-Christian ethics are ripped out of the hearts and minds of Western culture. He says, our challenge is to rise to this hour of incredible challenge and opportunity. And as we kind of wrapped up the end of this, our last unit, we talked about, right, the Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, the undermining of the authority of the church, and the kind of ripping of Judeo-Christian ethics out of Western society. He says, we're living at a crossroads. There's been an ideological shift. So now that we're here, what does it take to rise to the opportunity? And then he's going to kind of give the secret. He says, at last we come to the heart of the matter. The cross reminds us that the battle in the West is not so much between church and state as it is within our own hearts. If Christ has all of us, if the cross stands above politics in the world, we shall overcome regardless of the cost. So he says the focus, the goal, our priority has to be on a daily basis the cross. It can't be the right historical interpretation. It can't be having all the doctrine, everything all lined up perfectly. We need to focus on the person of Jesus Christ and the cross. So the last slide here, we got to ask ourselves, what is God doing in history? We've heard a lot of stories. We've heard exciting things. We've heard tragic things. We've heard boring things. We've heard exciting things. And I'm going to just try to encourage you as a history teacher in an online course. I don't know how much I've been able to really explain this is the pattern, and this is how God works. We've seen some past patterns and some cause and effects and consequences. But there's going to be a lot of times in history where, like Job, things are going to happen that we don't understand. And people are going to try to explain and say, this is why it happened. This is how God works. This is how he operates. And so there's some good principles out there. But I would encourage us to have a spirit of humility when we come to it. Again, there's a song, and I may have mentioned it earlier in the semester, but by J.J. Heller called Who You Are. And he says, um, we may not know what God's doing in Western history, but we know who he is. Right? And one of the lines in there, it says, sometimes life doesn't make any sense of war and pain and accidents. But sometimes I don't know what you're doing, God, but I know who you are. And one of the lines in there says, you do have a father's heart. It's not that God doesn't understand. It's not that he doesn't empathize. It's not that he's non-compassionate and he's just up there doing whatever it feels like. It says because he has a father's heart, right? And a love that's wild. And he knows what it's like to lose a child. So God the Father has hurt like we have. And so as life hits us and history doesn't make sense, remember that God knows and he can empathize and he loves and he does care. And I don't know all the patterns, but I do know what he's trying to do because he stated in his word what he's trying to accomplish. Like as we get personal, he's trying to work all things together for good, yes, and we've started the class with this, to conform us to the image of his son. We mean things for Israel for evil. God intends things and he works things out for good. That's what he does, right? And he does it for his glory because it's not to us. Psalm 115:1. Not to us, but to his name be the glory. So as we focus on the cross, as we wrap up this course, hopefully you've learned some history, hopefully you've had a lot of fun, and it's been a helpful and a beneficial course. But always, if you take nothing else away, remember this. You'll forget the facts, the figures. You're going to forget the dates. You're going to forget the people. But remember that God is at work to make us more like Jesus. And he'll do whatever it takes, even if it requires war and pain and accidents and a lot of things that just hurt really bad. He loves us incredibly. Never forget it. Love you guys too, and hope this has been as good an experience for you as it's been for me. Take care.